Morning. I'm starting to look like an old English sheepdog, but it's going to be a long time till I get a haircut. I may have to go back to braids, which I had before I had kids anyway. We are on the last slide on the economic expansion, and it talks about the expanding democracy in politics and government as well. We talked about society becoming much more democratic. Democratic means literally the rule of the people, and we saw how everything in society was more open to the common man, more available, and more about the common man rather than just for the aristocracy. We're doing the same thing in politics today, and if I have time, starting into Andrew Jackson, who is the great symbol of the age and a great symbol of democracy in America. Whether he should be or not is another question. That's something for you to decide. Okay, so I'm on, I think, slide 43 at the end of economic expansion, the democratization, the more democracy in politics. And one of the questions here, of course, is, as John Adams would have immediately said, can we have too much democracy? Is complete rule of the people necessarily a good thing? And we don't have complete democracy. Remember again who can't vote. You have women, Native Americans, most African Americans, and you still have slavery. So this is not democracy as we would define it today. But in New England particularly, even Catholics, Jews, African Americans in many cases could vote and often hold office as well. So it is moving in that direction. Okay, so is America more democratic by 1840 than it was in 1800? And I think you can argue, like that list that we had after the Revolution, although it's still not democracy as we know it, it is much more democratic. Some evidence of this, and probably the most important, is not quite universal, but almost universal white male vote. If you are an adult white male in America, you vote, except for parts of the South where you still had property qualifications. But in the rest of the country, you voted. Again, evidence for this in 1820 or so, something like 27% of adult white males voted. By 1850, before the Civil War, you have 78%, and really the peak becomes in the low 80s, 82, 84%. Okay, compare that to today. When we have a presidential election, people are really, really happy if we get over 50% in the low 50s. So you could argue that they were much more democratic in the mid 1800s than we are today. Not only did people have the vote, they actually voted. Remember, this is the only show in town. It is entertainment in a way, but people talked politics. People were heavily involved in politics. Another good example that I know firsthand, if you go to Greece and you pass by the little bars and the little taverns and coffee shops, when they have television sets on, they do watch sport games sometimes, but what they have on most of the time are live feeds from parliamentary discussions. And people in the cafes and the bars, they're sitting there arguing about politics. We don't do that so much in America. We watch a lot of sports. We don't watch live feeds from our congressional debates. They do in other countries. Okay, so other evidence. This is the key thing, that the vote is largely expanded. But you begin to get presidential nominees by caucuses, by conventions, in other words. Presidential electors in the Electoral College were by popular vote. People voted for them rather than having state legislatures pick them out. If you were running for president, you were nominated by your party, basically by a majority in your party. This is much more democratic than a bunch of guys in a smoke-filled back room picking out who they want to be their presidential candidate. Public inauguration. A lot of these measures are started by Andrew Jackson. He is a huge innovator and one reason why he's a figurehead for democracy. Andrew Jackson is the first guy to hold a public inauguration as president. So he was elected president in 1928, and he opens his inauguration to the public. The inauguration is when the president is sworn in. And today, of course, we have them openly. You can go to a presidential inauguration. You go to Washington, D.C., and you stand there on the day the president is sworn in, and usually they have a parade and stuff like that. But Andrew Jackson is the first. Before this time, they swore in presidents, usually in the House of Representatives and Congress, and only the congressmen were allowed to go. So this opens it up to the public. He came from Nashville, Tennessee. When he was elected, he said to his friends in Nashville, come on to the inauguration. A lot of them did come. So he had hundreds of political followers from Tennessee follow him. These are frontiersmen. They're pretty rough and wild guys. They were drinking when they came. They continued drinking whiskey during the inauguration. There were a lot of bottles passed around. After he's sworn in, there was a reception on the White House grounds. And basically, his following from Tennessee, these guys who are already pretty three sheets to the wind and pretty drunk at the time, trashed the White House. They tore down the curtains. They were jumping on the furniture. They were throwing china around. How did they finally stop it? Somebody in the kitchen had the brilliant idea of, let's put the punch bowl out on the lawn instead of in the White House. So they moved the big punch bowl out on the lawn. They put a couple bottles of whiskey in it. Everybody followed the punch bowl out. They locked him out of the White House. Otherwise, the White House would have been completely trashed. Whereas Andrew Jackson, the whole time, he's upstairs hiding in a bedroom. He had nothing to do with these guys. But this is public inauguration. The public was invited. Andrew Jackson is also the first guy to initiate political campaigns. Before this time, if you said you wanted to be president, pretty much it disqualified you in the eyes of most voters. They figured, you're greedy, you're after power, we don't want to elect this guy. Andrew Jackson is the first guy who openly says, I want to be president. I am campaigning for this. I am going out and trying to convince people to vote for me for president. I am seeking the office. It's the first media campaign. Now, they don't have much media then. They did have newspapers, but Andrew Jackson tours lots of parts of the country. He has barbecues, he has speakers, he gives talks, he has picnics, he has parades. They pass out a lot of fried chicken. They pass out a lot of course, whiskey again. Again, this is entertainment. It's the only show in town. So he's the guy who shifted the focus in political campaigns from ideas. Think about Adams, Jefferson, Madison, to personality. So why are we voting for Andrew Jackson? He's a smart guy, but he is not well educated. He is not a great intellect like Adams or Jefferson or Madison. Why? Because he's a war hero like George Washington, and because people like him. He's just like us. He can belt down a few too. The campaign slogan for Jackson was Adams can write, but Jackson, of course, can fight. So what do we vote for in America? We like the war heroes. We like the guys that fight. We're always a little suspicious of intellectuals and guys who are way too smart. Okay, in the campaign, Andrew Jackson really never stated his positions on anything. He never mentioned slavery. He never mentioned foreign affairs. He just campaigned that I'm a nice guy, I'm a regular guy just like you, and won overwhelmingly. He also introduces the spoils system. Okay, this is another word for this is patronage. It's from the old Latin phrase, to the victor belong the spoils of war. You win the election. What do you get to do? You get to put all your people in government jobs. So basically, this is an exchange of jobs. What are you going to do to get the job? You get out the vote for Andrew Jackson. So jobs for votes, or votes for jobs, whatever. How did he do this? Basically, people who campaigned for him, people who convinced their friends to come out, he rewarded them with jobs. So George Washington, John Adams together in 12 years replaced 9 people in government with their own appointees. Thomas Jefferson replaced 39. And people were worried about Thomas Jefferson having a revolution, which wasn't. Andrew Jackson, in comparison, replaced 919 government positions. This is still only 15% of government employees, but it seems like an awful lot, and it was an awful lot compared to earlier presidents. He put his friends in office. I'm quoting Andrew Jackson. He's a frontiersman. He's a pretty rough guy. If I had a tit for every one of these pigs to suck on, they'd be my friends still. In other words, if I hand out favors, people will be loyal to me. Does any of this sound familiar? Couple of examples. This is not always a good thing. Sometimes people are qualified, oftentimes they were not. He put people in ambassador positions who had absolutely no experience. He sent an ambassador to France who didn't speak a word of French. This is not a good thing in the 1800s. Same thing with Spain. He appointed a New York City tax collector to collect taxes on imports, a very important job with a lot of money. The guy left the country a year later with $1 million in U.S. tax money in his pocket and was never heard from again. So putting your friends in office is not necessarily a good thing. Some are qualified, some are not. What was his thinking besides rewarding friends? But any public official should be able to, the role of any public official should be able to be filled by any adult male. Anybody of average intellect should be able to do every government job. May have been true in 1830, certainly is not true now. Contemporary examples from both sides. Barack Obama, for one thing, I know for a fact, during his second term, appointed 3 ambassadors. None of those 3 had ever, one was to Belgium and one was to one of the Scandinavian countries, I forget the third. None of the 3 had ever been to the country or spoke the language of the country. So both sides do this. And of course, we have a lot of contemporary examples with Trump as well. The other thing that Andrew Jackson originates is a permanent 2-party system. From the point that Andrew Jackson becomes president, you either have his supporters, which were called Democratic Republicans. Later on, they drop the second and it becomes Democrats. Again, don't compare to Democrats, Republicans today, but Andrew Jackson creates a new Democratic Party. And his opponents, people who hated Andrew Jackson, who were called the Whigs from the British Party against the King. Andrew Jackson's nickname as president was King Andrew. So a lot of people were worried about him taking a lot of power. You have another party rising in the 1930s and 40s. It is a nativist, pro-native-born American, not American natives, and it's called the Know Nothing Party. They have one platform, anti-immigrant. This goes way back in American history, especially Catholics, later on the Irish when they come in. So there is a whole party that is anti-immigrant in America that exists for about 10 or 15 years. Why are they called the Know-Nothings? When people asked them about their position, they said, I know nothing. They wouldn't talk about it because they knew it was highly controversial. So what do we have? In general, Andrew Jackson revolutionizes American politics, just like American society was being revolutionized, and it becomes much more democratic, much more open to the public. The ordinary average man has much more access and involvement in politics. In fact, probably more than most of us have today as well. Okay, so I'm going to continue and start with Andrew Jackson. That is the next slide, the next file called White Men's Democracy. The second slide there is a portrait, and it's taken from the same cover of the, sorry, this is not very good. Can't do this on video. And it is the definitive biography of Andrew Jackson. Great portrait of him. And the title of the book is, I'm doing it backwards, American Lion, which is a perfect term for Andrew Jackson. He is the great lion of democracy. He, along with Thomas Jefferson, are the symbols of democracy in America. And democracy changes. The definition of democracy changes, and Andrew Jackson did this. The other question with Andrew Jackson is, when they made Mount Rushmore, absolutely Jefferson, absolutely George Washington was on it. They considered Andrew Jackson and decided, no, we're not going to put him on. There's good reasons for that. Okay. Andrew Jackson is the main figure of the 1800s between Jefferson in the very early 1800s and Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. There is no other major name between those two except for Andrew Jackson. He is the great symbol of the age, more for what he did than his personality, although a very interesting personality. And he changes the definition of democracy. If you remember early years of the Republic, George Washington, why is he elected? He's a war hero. He's an aristocrat. He's a very wealthy man. Okay, he's a natural choice. There was a natural aristocracy of the people who were rich. Thomas Jefferson changes the definition. He talks about a natural aristocracy, not the wealthy, but the talented and the educated. So this was now open to poor men as well. Andrew Jackson changes that, and it becomes a government by and of the people. Not for the people, not people doing it for you, but the people doing it for themselves. So unlike Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson says, not only can you be poor, you can also be uneducated and be president. Look at me, because I was uneducated and I'm elected president. This is the great era of the common man in politics, in society, and Andrew Jackson embodies the common man. He is wildly popular in the West and the South especially. So who is Andrew Jackson? I'm going back to the first slide, the text here. He is 6'2", reddish hair. Not only is he Scots ancestry, he is Scots. His parents came from Scotland. They moved to Ireland, then they moved to the North-South Carolina border, the back country. When they moved there, the Indians were still a serious problem. There were still Indian raids going on. They moved into a community with some relatives, which is why they picked there to move in. And Andrew Jackson is the third son. He has two older brothers, a couple years older, and he is born posthumously. What does that mean? He is born after his father has died. Father was killed in some kind of an accident. So here is a mother. She has a newborn. She has two little boys under the age of 6 or 7. And there are 11 older cousins in the neighborhood as well. So he grew up in this whole community, an extended family essentially. But she's on the frontier. She has 3 little boys. Most women, what you would do is find an unmarried guy and marry immediately. For whatever reason, we do not know. She never wrote anything. She did not marry. So how do you support 3 little kids on the frontier? She became essentially an indentured servant for her relatives. So Andrew Jackson grows up absolutely dirt poor. The only reason they survived was the relatives pitched in and helped the mom. He remembered as an adult, he wrote about, I never had a present, we never celebrated a holiday. He was hired help, basically, for relatives. As a result, and again, because he's on the frontier, he had very minimal education. He was absolutely literate, but not much more than that. Very poor writer, better speaker than a writer. And throughout his childhood, because they went back and asked relatives of his and got stories when he became president, this is a little boy from the age of 5 or 6 who has absolutely uncontrollable rages, basically temper tantrums. And his relatives talked about, at the age of 5 or 6, the other cousins, he's the youngest of like 11 cousins, you never tease Andrew, you never play practical jokes on Andrew, because he would grab a kitchen knife and come after you. He'd say, foaming at the mouth like a mad dog, I'm going to cut your heart out, I'm going to kill you. So this is a guy who as a child had absolutely no anger management, let's put it that way. Revolution comes along. His brother is 18 years old. He immediately joins the Patriot cause to fight for independence, and he dies of an illness out with the militia. Andrew is now 13 years old. He and the second brother, who's maybe 15 years old, go and join the local militia. The whole group is caught by the British. They are taken in. The commander of the British battalion that brought them in looks over these guys. They're now prisoners of war. And he points to the youngest one, which was clearly Andrew, and says, "Boy, come here, polish my boots." Well, we don't know exactly what Andrew Jackson said, but you can imagine his attitude towards this. The commander gets pissed off at this little guy talking back to him and basically takes out his sword, slashes him across the face and across the hand when he put up his hand to block the sword. To his grave, he carried both scars. And if you look at that portrait, on the second slide, you can actually see a little line for the scar on his face. So his attitude towards the British was never very good. It's not surprising he's happy to go down to New Orleans and fight the British again. So he is knocked out by the British officer. His brother jumps in to help him. He is also slashed across the head with the officer, knocked unconscious. They're both taken in by their friends. The officer says, "Get them out of here." And a couple days later, the mom has tracked them down. She begs the officer to release them. They're just boys. He says, "I don't want to see them again. Get them out." They walk 45 miles home. It's winter. It's a storm. The brother gets pneumonia. He dies of pneumonia and blood poisoning from the untreated wound a couple days later. So here's Andrew Jackson, the only surviving son. The mother, 2 years later, dies of a fever, nursing relatives. He went back when he was president and tried to find her grave, and she was buried in an unmarked grave. He could never even find his mother's grave. So at 14 years old, Andrew Jackson is an orphan. He has nobody. He moved to Nashville, Tennessee, a very young man. He starts working with a lawyer. He eventually gets a law license, so he's not illiterate, although when he campaigned, he put up a front that, hey, I'm just like you, I'm not a learned man, I'm pretty functionally illiterate. He was not at all. If you go to his home in Nashville today, the Hermitage, I've been there, he had quite an extensive library, but he never talked about that part because people related to the fact that he was just like them. So he gets a law license in Nashville. He was living with in a boarding house, and the landlady's daughter, who was 3 years older than him, he fell madly in love with. So she was technically married to a much older man in Kentucky. She had been married very briefly for whatever reason. She separated. She immediately went back home to her mother, and the guy was never heard from again, but she was married before. They fall madly in love. Jackson and Rachel run off. They get married in a neighboring county, and they live together. She eventually filed for divorce, but they were married before the divorce is final. So technically, what is this? This is adultery, although they did get a divorce later. They are absolutely devoted to each other, but this followed them all the way through and became an issue in the presidential campaign because Andrew Jackson had married, quote, another man's wife. He rises in politics. He has legal training. He is a Tennessee state representative. He is appointed to the Supreme Court in Tennessee for 6 years. He serves on there. He becomes U.S. Senator. He's 61 when he's elected president, and he lived to be 78 years old. So if you look at the last slide on there, slide 11, you can see what Andrew Jackson looked like a year before he died at the age of 78. It helps to have a good head of hair in politics. He never lost his hair, and you get a good impression of his personality. This is a tough old bird. This is not a guy you want to mess with. As Supreme Court Justice for 6 years, one of his other justices on the bench said his opinions were, and I'm quoting, short, unlearned, ungrammatical, and always right. So he didn't know books, but he knew people, and he knew the law pretty well. So by the time he's president, he had spent 30 years in politics in one way or another. He also, when he was president, subscribed to 17 different newspapers and read most of them. So he was pretty well informed about what was going on. again, you can compare this to contemporary figures. His nickname, Old Hickory. Hickory is a northern tree. It is not found in the South, but hickory is stronger than oak. So here's a guy who doesn't bend and doesn't break. Absolutely surrounded by tragedies. He never had kids. They were unable to have children. They adopted one of her sister's twin sons, raised that kid as their own, named him Andrew Jr. He dies as an adult in a hunting accident. After he's elected president, when they're packing to move to Washington 2 days before Christmas, he hears a scream from downstairs. He runs downstairs. Rachel has fallen on the floor in the living room. She dies of a heart attack a day later. So when he went to Washington, he was a bachelor. He took his niece, a woman married to his nephew, and her family with several little kids to serve as his first lady, to serve as hostess in the White House. She, in the middle of his term, dies of tuberculosis. He adopted at the Indian campaigns a little orphaned little Indian baby that nobody knew what to do with. He says, "Bring me that baby." In the middle of an Indian war, takes the child home. It is raised as his own son, as an adopted son. That boy dies of disease at age 15. So basically, Andrew Jackson is the kiss of death. Everybody around him dies of one thing or another. And I'm going to stop there. We'll talk about Andrew Jackson as president and the 3 major acts of his administration. Stay safe. Enjoy the sunshine.